With me is Dr. Rob Lutton of the Department of History here in Nottingham. He's an expert on popular religion in the later Middle Ages, and that's one of these vast subjects, so I'm going to try and ask him why study popular religion, and what are the big questions at the moment? I know it's an unfair question, but everyone has to start somewhere.
Yes. Okay. I mean, religion hasn't gone away. I think I think in the late 20th century, there were lots of people who, the whole secularization agenda, and there was I told us, and a lot of people were telling us that religion was becoming less important, and like it or loathe it, for good or bad, it hasn't gone away. And we're now, in the next century, and realizing that religion is here to stay, it seems, and that it shapes our lives, whatever we believe as individuals. One of the things I do with my students, I teach a special subject on popular religion in late medieval England, and I start off by trying to get them to think about what religion is, whether it's even a definable category of human experience. There's a tradition of studying religion amongst historians and theologians and anthropologists, and that's established. But how we actually think about religion in terms of human experience and practice and thought, I think is I find that fascinating. Is this something that is discrete or definable in a particular way? And I try to get them thinking about that. And by working on religion in any period of human history, one is confronted with that question: what is it exactly? What is our subject here? What are we looking at? There are other fundamental questions, I think, about studying popular religion. One of the most important ones is this question of Christianization or not in the Middle Ages. And the debate about the extent to which the church is successful in the Middle Ages at Christianizing the population, and how they go about doing that. So those are two of the fundamental questions that I start with in teaching popular religion.
One of the fundamental problems about popular religion is that academic religion survives in texts. Formal liturgy survives in service books. How do you discover what the guy following the plough or the woman making bread in her kitchen was thinking? There's a problem. How do you get around the evidence gap?
Yeah, it's very difficult. Because usually the evidence is written by religious professionals, by clerics. Not always, but usually. And so we are having to read between the lines very often, I think. We're having to read against the grain. And so the things that concern clerical writers, for example, maybe take, for example, a text about confession, written for a priest to be a better confessor, hearing his parishioners' confessions. And we can use that as a way of trying to understand what priestly pastoral concerns constituted, say in the 15th century, which gives us, I think it does give us a purchase on the sorts of problems that priests are encountering in popular belief. So are these issues about people not knowing the Ten Commandments, for example, or is it that there are always lots of questions about sexual sin? This seems to be something that just comes up a lot in the confessional. But all the time, one is having to read through the preconceptions of clerical writers and readers. So, for example, preconceptions about female sexuality, which are pretty misogynistic, We're looking back on them now. We would read them in those terms, and so we have to be very, very careful with that evidence. But to give another example, the research I'm doing at the moment is on the cult of the holy name of Jesus, which becomes a popular devotional form in late medieval England, and it has a liturgical tradition. It develops that, so there is a mass of the holy name, which is celebrated often on Fridays in parish churches. There's an annual feast. Music and song becomes a really important part of that devotion. Lay people band together to form Jesus fraternities and guilds, and there's also a mystical tradition. So there are writings that are produced which are teaching people how to use the name of Jesus as a mantra, if you like, as a devotional technique, as a mystical technique. And there are ways in which we can use that evidence, I think, to look at the ways in which it is copied and disseminated and annotated in texts, which can tell us something about what people are actually doing with it. So I can think of one example in a manuscript of a picture of rosary beads next to an actual text, next to the words, which tells us about actual practice. Or we can look at the other sorts of text alongside which those prayers sit, which give us a sense of how people might be using them in their daily devotions, for example. But it is really difficult. It's not at all easy, because we can't interview these people, and most of the time they don't write down what they do in their private chamber.
And yet, I'm very struck when you give the example of the devotion to the holy name. If you were to read any of the standard textbooks on the history of liturgy, you might get one or two footnotes on that. And yet, that is what actually animated more people than some of the great development, say, in chant, that will because it'll represent itself in music books, in cathedrals, and have been properly catalogued, have been carefully stored. The historians tend to read the history of religion of the bookmaking class and the book storing class. And I've often been struck by the fact that if you look at the liturgy in a great cathedral, that is the liturgy as you find it in the books. And the further you go out into all the umpteen little churches that surround the cathedral in the medieval city, and then you go out into the countryside,
Yes.
The whole texture of religion and liturgy and belief changes.
Yes, that's right. And I think for me, it's about trying to reconstruct that world, and how there isn't an average parishioner, he or she doesn't exist, but how your fairly ordinary person would have experienced the liturgy, for example, on a week by week basis. How much preaching did they hear? For example, that's one of the things I'm trying to get to the bottom of in relation to the cult of the holy name. There's not much sermon material that survives on this, but people must have preached about it because there was an annual feast and it was something that was celebrated on a regular basis. And so I think it is about moving away from ideal representations of how religion ought to be done to how it actually was practiced and experienced on a daily basis.
Tell me, what value? I'm struck by two. I know because by the very nature of literary texts, even though they're vernacular texts, they're automatically not popular in a very popular sense. But if you think of Piers Plowman, or you think of the Canterbury Tales, it's interesting that both of these, you get both good clerics and bad clerics. And to what extent can those images be valuable in discovering popular religion?
I think they're very valuable. They give us a good sense of the sorts of images, the sorts of the ways in which society thought about its religious professionals, or the ways in which they could think about them. In Chaucer, there's one individual, the parson,
Mm.
who is doing his job at all properly. He's completely idealised, though.
Yeah. But of course,
to the nth degree.
you also have the indulgence seller there.
Yes, yes,
The
and they're all
partner.
there. All the other, religious professionals come in, are berated.
Mm.
They are set up as stereotypical villains.
Yeah.
And we have to look at other sorts of evidence, which suggests that quite a lot of parishioners were reasonably happy with their parish priests and the other clerics that they rub shoulders with, but also on a regular basis they are critiquing their behaviour and calling them to account. So that there's a great interest, I think, in them doing their jobs properly.
Yeah. And just to conclude on this, of course, the study of popular religion is itself a very new part of the discipline of history.
Yes, yes, it is. And
We're actually the first generation that really have done it since we were undergraduates.
absolutely, and it represents a move away from traditional institutional church history, and is part of the rise of social history, history from below. Really, actually from the 50s onwards, but that really flowered in the 60s. There's been something of a reaction to that now as well, and I think more recently the claim has been made that we shouldn't be thinking about elite and popular anymore, but we need to be thinking about more holistically about the interaction between elite and popular. I still think it's important to remember that the religion of, say, the husbandman was different to the religion of a bishop.
Yeah.
There are very fundamental differences there, I think.
Rob, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.